A Collar Out of Place, written by Cindy Kirk. Chapter 1. By the time Jory stopped walking, I knew something was wrong. Not wrong in the way people use the word when they mean inconvenient or unexpected. Wrong in the way your stomach tightens before your mind catches up. He'd been padding along beside me since the corner by the bakery. No leash, no hurry, just Jory doing what he always did. Walking with whoever happened to be headed in the same direction. The afternoon was warm for late spring, the kind that carried the smell of lilacs and fresh-cut grass, and by the time we reached the park, he'd already been greeted half a dozen times, his name called like an old friend's. "Hey there, Jory." "Looking good today, boy." He accepted it all with calm dignity, as if he understood Cornwall was his town, and we were lucky to live in it with him. Ahead of us, the park path curved toward the square where Pause Remembered was already underway. Twine stretched along the remembrance rail dotted with collars, leather worn smooth, nylon faded from years of sun, a few braided by hand. Voices drifted through the afternoon air, low and gentle. Dogs of every size and age moved alongside their people, some eager, some careful, some carried. Jory had been trotting along easily enough. Then he stopped, sat, and refused to move. "Well, that's new," I murmured, slowing beside him as gravel crunched under my shoes. Ahead, people stood near the rail, fingers brushing metal and fabric before stepping back, as if each collar deserved its own quiet moment. I followed Jory's gaze. There was an empty space along the rail, small, easy to miss, a gap no wider than my hand. But Jory stared at it like it mattered. Laughter rose farther down the path. Someone called a name. Life, as usual, moving forward whether you were ready or not. Cornwall was like that. Gentle, steady, rarely careless with the things that belonged to people. Jory leaned forward, sniffed once, then sat back on his haunches, staring at the empty hook like he was waiting for something to reappear. I was still studying it when someone touched my arm. "Pen?" I turned to find my cousin Isla beside me. Unlike most of the town who had come dressed casually for the late spring event, Isla wore a pink and white striped dress that accentuated her blonde prettiness. She was a girly girl and used any excuse to dress up. "I thought you were working," I said. Isla and her two sisters owned Three Whiskers Coffee. My business, Augustus Loom, was just down the street. "Elise told me to take the afternoon off," she said, mentioning her eldest sister. "She knows how much stuff like this means to me." Isla leaned forward, resting her fingers lightly on a pale pink collar braided with ribbon. Kitty Purries, I realized. Her tabby had passed the winter before last. Isla's fingers lingered there a moment longer than necessary. "I put this here in tribute to Kitty," she said. "I got her for my 7th birthday." "She was a great cat," I said, "and she had a wonderful life." My gaze drifted back to the gap along the rail. There have been a lot added since I walked by here this morning. I could have sworn there was another one right here. Isla glanced where I pointed, frowned, looked again. "Huh?" she said. "Yeah, there was." My stomach gave a small, uneasy twist. "Queen Eliza barks," Isla went on, her voice lowering. "Mildred Paulskill's poodle. Her collar was right here. See?" She indicated the space between two hooks. Mildred liked her fine, but Arthur... She paused, shaking her head slightly. Eliza Bark was his baby. Arthur Paulskill, Mildred's husband. He'd loved that dog more than most people loved anything. "And that collar," Isla added. "You remember it, right? That purple stone? Arthur bought it years ago. He was always drawn to things that caught the light." A faint smile flickered, then faded. He'd be heartbroken if he thought it was gone. I nodded slowly. I did remember. The stone, bright against Eliza Bark's silver fur, had caught the sun every time Arthur walked her through the square. Jory huffed again, soft but insistent, and shifted closer to the rail. Isla followed his gaze. It's almost like he knows something's off. I think he does. Mildred put it up early, Isla said. She was here when I stopped to hang Kitty's collar. Laughter floated toward us again, bright and out of place. I looked at the empty hook once more, a hollow feeling settling in my chest. Cornwall noticed absences. People here showed up when something, or someone, went missing. Maybe the collar had slipped free, or maybe someone had decided it was worth taking. Jory kept staring at the empty hook like he knew which answer was right. Chapter 2. Mildred Paulskill stood just off the path, her hands folded loosely at her waist, watching the remembrance rail the way some people watch the weather, quietly, without expectation. She wasn't crying. That was the first thing I noticed. Even with the warmth of the afternoon, she wore a light gray cardigan buttoned neatly over a navy blouse. Her hair, still mostly dark despite her age, was pinned back in a style that suggested she'd been wearing it the same way for decades. Practical. Orderly. Mildred had always struck me as a woman who believed in doing things properly, even when no one was looking. Jory spotted her before I did. He ambled over and sat a polite distance from her shoes, his tail thumping once against the grass. "Well, hello there," Mildred said, her voice soft but steady. She bent slightly and rested her fingers on Jory's head. "You've come to check on things, have you?" Jory accepted the greeting, then glanced pointedly toward the rail. I stepped closer. "Hi, Mildred." "Oh, Penelope," she said, turning with a small smile. "Isn't it a lovely turnout?" "It really is." Her gaze drifted back to the collars. People came and went, pausing briefly, touching a tag or buckle before moving on. Mildred watched them all with calm attentiveness, as if she were hosting without realizing it. "I didn't know if I'd come this year," she said, "but Arthur always said it was good to show up, even when it hurt." I nodded, unsure what words would be welcome. She took a few careful steps toward the rail and stopped in front of the empty space Isla and I had noticed earlier. Her eyes lingered there, though she didn't frown or gasp or do anything that might draw attention. "That's funny," she said after a moment. "What is?" "I was sure I hung it there." She gestured to the gap. "Right in the middle. Arthur liked things centered." My chest tightened. "Queen Eliza Bark's collar?" I asked. "Yes." Mildred smiled. "He always said she deserved the best view." She reached into her cardigan pocket, then shook her head. "It must have slipped. The twine gets loose sometimes, doesn't it?" "Sometimes," I said. She didn't sound convinced, but she didn't sound alarmed either, just thoughtful. "It's silly to fuss," she added. "It's only a collar." Only she didn't say it like she believed it. Jory shifted closer to the rail and sniffed once, his ears angling forward. Mildred noticed. "He's very attentive today." "He's been like that all afternoon," I said, "especially right here." She studied the empty hook again, then smoothed the front of her cardigan. "Arthur would have laughed, said I was misplacing things again." I hesitated, then asked, "Did anyone help you hang it earlier?" "Oh, no." She shook her head. "I came early, before most folks arrived. It was calm then. Just me and my thoughts." She said it lightly, but the words settled heavier than she meant them to. "I'm sure it'll turn up," she went on. "Things have a way of doing that in Cornwall." I hoped she was right. When Mildred stepped away, Jory remained where he was, his gaze fixed on the rail, his body tense in a way that didn't match the gentle afternoon. I watched the space where the collar should have been a moment longer, thinking of Arthur Paulskill and the careful way he'd lived his life, of a man who liked things centered, of a woman who wasn't yet ready to believe something had been taken from her. Mildred paused halfway down the path and glanced back once more at the rail. Then she smiled to herself and kept walking, and suddenly I wanted very much for that collar to turn up before she came back tomorrow. Chapter 3. Three Whiskers smelled like espresso and warm milk and something faintly sweet. Vanilla, maybe, or the lingering promise of a pastry long since claimed. The front windows were open to the mild afternoon, and a bell chimed as I stepped inside. Elise stood behind the counter, sleeves rolled, hair pulled back, wearing the practiced calm of someone who'd survived both morning rushes and afternoon lulls. Marmalade, the orange tabby, was draped across the counter's far end like a decorative throw pillow, his tail flicking lazily. "Hey, Pen," Elise said, already reaching for a mug. "The usual?" "Yes, please," I said. "You look like you survived the morning." "Barely," she said dryly, then smiled. "But it's quiet now. Miracles do happen." She slid the mug of black coffee toward me, steam curling between us. "I saw Isla at Pause Remembered," I said, wrapping my hands around the cup. "Will you be heading over later?" "I went early," Elise said. "Before opening, Isla and I switched off so at least one of us could go without worrying about the shop." "That sounds like you." Elise shrugged. "It was beautiful this year, really beautiful." She glanced toward the window as if the park might still be visible from here. "Some of those collars, even the simple ones, you can tell they held a lot of life." I nodded. "I noticed that too." A woman seated at the small round table near the window leaned back in her chair, coffee cradled in both hands. "Did you see Bo's bandana?" she asked. "Cody Will always tied it crooked, like he couldn't get it quite right." Elise laughed. "That red one with the frayed edge? Yeah, hard to miss." "And Queen Eliza barks," someone else added from farther down the counter. "The jeweled one?" the woman asked. "Oh, it was gorgeous, on her and off." I kept my eyes on my coffee, listening. "Makes sense he'd go for the jewels," Elise said. "Arthur was into stones. Remember how he used to bring them in here sometimes? Lay them out on the table like he was dealing cards." "I always wondered if that one was real," the woman said. "That purple stone, amethyst, maybe?" Elise tipped her head. "I don't know. It sure caught the light." "I remember someone saying," the woman went on slowly, "that collar was probably worth a pretty penny." She didn't say it with envy, more with curiosity which lingered after the words were gone. "I don't think Arthur would have liked hearing that," Elise said. "He liked how things looked, not what they cost." "That's true," the woman said. "Still, people notice things." Marmalade shifted on the counter, stretching before settling again. I took a sip of my coffee and let the conversation drift, my thoughts circling back to the rail, to the empty hook, to Mildred's certainty that she'd hung it just right. "Elise," I said casually, "when you went early, do you remember seeing Eliza Bark's collar?" She frowned, just slightly. "I think so. I didn't study it, but yeah, I remember the purple stone catching the light." I said. "Why?" she asked. I hesitated, then smiled. "No reason, just checking my memory." Elise studied me for a beat, then nodded. "Well, if it is, you're not alone. That happens around here." The woman at the table laughed. "Cornwall has a way of rearranging itself when you're not looking." "That it does," Elise said. I finished my coffee more slowly than usual, the hum of the shop settling around me. Nothing felt urgent. Nothing felt wrong. And yet, as I headed for the door, I glanced back at the counter. Marmalade had shifted again, now watching the entrance with lazy interest, as if waiting for something, or someone, to arrive. Outside, the afternoon light felt a shade sharper than before. Somewhere between the park and the coffee shop, a simple truth had taken root. Noticing something was rarely harmless. I walked back toward the square with the uneasy awareness that once you saw a thing clearly, you didn't always get to decide what came next. Chapter 4. I didn't go looking for answers right away. That wasn't how things worked in Cornwall. You noticed first, you listened, you let people talk, and if you were patient, the shape of the truth often revealed itself without your having to pry. Arthur Paulskill's shape was easy enough to remember. He'd been a fixture at community events long before I paid much attention to such things. A quiet man with a steady smile and an unhurried way of moving through the world. He wasn't loud or particularly social, but he showed up. For meetings, for fundraisers, for anyone who needed help lifting heavy items or fixing something that didn't quite work anymore. He'd loved Mildred. That much was obvious to anyone who'd ever seen them together. But when Queen Elizabeth came into their lives, something shifted. The poodle had been their late-in-life surprise, a standard-sized silver puff of personality who followed Arthur like a shadow and slept curled against his legs at night. "She's a pretty girl," he used to say, as if stating a fact. "Pretty things deserve pretty things." That had been his explanation for the collar. Not money, not investment, beauty. Arthur hadn't been wealthy. Everyone knew that. He and Mildred lived carefully, comfortably, the way retirees often did when they'd planned well enough but had no illusions about abundance. His one indulgence, if you could call it that, had been the Cornwall Gem Society. Once a month they gathered in borrowed spaces with folding tables and bad coffee, laying out stones like treasures, even when they weren't. Arthur never talked about value, not once. He talked about color, about clarity, about the patience it took for something beautiful to form slowly, unseen. That was the man I remembered. And it wasn't how anyone would have described a man hiding worth in a dog's collar. The more I thought about it, the less the story taking shape around town made sense. Jory nudged my leg, bringing me back to the present. We were near the park again now, the path quiet after the crowd had thinned, the afternoon slipping toward evening. "All right," I said, "show me." He padded ahead a few steps, nose low, then stopped near the edge of the path where the grass met the gravel. He pawed once, lightly, then stepped back. At first, I saw nothing. Then I crouched and spotted it, half hidden near the leg of a bench, creased and darkened from damp earth. A scrap of paper. I picked it up carefully and unfolded it. A rough oval had been sketched in pencil, shaded unevenly. Beside it, one word had been written, then crossed out and rewritten. Amethyst? Below it, smaller, almost tentative. Arthur's? I stared at the page for a long moment. It wasn't a plan, it wasn't proof, it was a question. Someone wondering, someone hoping, someone telling themselves a story before they'd finished thinking it through. I folded the paper again and slipped it into my pocket, my chest tight for reasons that had nothing to do with gemstones. Arthur wouldn't have hidden money in a dog's collar. He wouldn't have wanted someone to take something so personal and turn it into something transactional. But he would have helped, would have listened, would have found a way to offer what he could, even if it wasn't much. That generosity, that decency, had been mistaken for permission. Jory sat beside me now, calm again, as if whatever had unsettled him earlier had finally been acknowledged. The problem wasn't greed, it was pressure. The kind that made good people tell themselves the wrong story. Whoever had taken the collar hadn't meant for harm to follow, and now that I understood this, I knew I couldn't let this turn into something louder or crueler than it needed to be. Chapter 5. By late afternoon, Paws remembered had softened at the edges. The biggest crowds had drifted back toward Main Street and supper plans, leaving behind a placid version of the event, families lingering on benches, older couples walking slowly beneath the trees, dogs dozing in patches of sun as if they'd carried the weight of everyone's memories and found it perfectly manageable. I walked the path again with Jory at my side, letting my thoughts settle into something more orderly. If someone from the Cornwall Gem Society had taken Queen Elizabark's collar, it wasn't because they wanted to hurt Mildred. It was because they'd convinced themselves they weren't really taking it from her at all. They'd told themselves a story, and stories, especially the wrong ones, had a way of spreading. I scanned the small groups as I passed. A handful of faces I recognized from Gem Society meetings. Men with pockets full of polishing cloths. Women wearing simple pendants that caught the light when they spoke. People who traded stones the way others traded family recipes. Careful and proud and a little sentimental. Jory trotted along easily enough, pausing to accept a scratch here and there, allowing himself to be admired like the local celebrity he was. Then, without warning, he veered. Not running, not darting like he'd spotted a squirrel, just choosing. He crossed the grass with calm purpose and stopped beside a picnic table near the far edge of the square. A man sat there alone, elbows on the tabletop, staring out at nothing in particular. Jory sat beside him, the man's hand lifted automatically, resting on Jory's head as if that was where it belonged. He didn't look surprised. If anything, he seemed relieved. I slowed a few steps away. Carl Rogers, late 50s, broad-shouldered in a way that suggested a life once spent moving more than sitting. His hair was thinning at the crown, his face drawn with the look of someone who hadn't slept well in weeks. I knew him best from Gem Society meetings at Three Whiskers, the kind of member who asked thoughtful questions, who stayed to help clean up, who always looked slightly embarrassed when someone admired a stone he'd brought. He looked like a man carrying something heavy and not knowing where to set it down. I could have turned away. I could have told myself I was mistaken. But Jory didn't move. He just sat there, patient and certain, as if the decision had already been made. I let out a soft breath and headed toward the vendor stand near the fountain. The frozen lemonade machine whirred loudly, the kind of cheery, mechanical sound that made everything feel normal, no matter what you were thinking. 2, I told the teenager behind the counter. He handed me the cups, cold and bright, lemon slices pressed against the sides. I carried them carefully across the grass, my palms aching from the chill. Carl watched me approach, his gaze flicking to the drinks and back to Jory. I held out one cup. Thought you might want this. For a moment, he didn't take it. Then his fingers closed around the cup like it was something solid he could hold on to. Thank you. I sat on the bench opposite him, leaving space enough that he wouldn't feel cornered. Jory remained at his side, leaning lightly against his knee. We sat in silence for a few seconds, the sounds of the square filling the gap, laughter from the sidewalk, a dog barking once in the distance, the low murmur of conversation. Carl swallowed. I shouldn't have done it. No, I said. His shoulders sagged. I didn't mean to make trouble for Mildred. I don't think you did. That was when he looked at me. Really looked. Surprise flickered across his face, followed by something like relief. Arthur was one of the good ones, he said. He was. Carl stared toward the remembrance rail, visible through the trees. I kept telling myself he'd have handed it to me if he were still around. I didn't argue. I didn't need to. I lost my job in Madison right before Christmas, he said, downsizing. He gave a strained half smile. I've got 2 teenagers at home who eat like it's their job. He exhaled slowly. I heard people talking about that collar, how pretty it was, how it might be real, and I thought, maybe Arthur wouldn't want something like that just hanging there. His fingers tightened around the cup. The second it was in my hand, I knew I'd crossed a line. He blinked once. I didn't sell it. I couldn't. It's been in my jacket pocket all afternoon, and it feels like it's burning a hole through me. I believe you, I said. Something in his posture loosened, like a knot finally giving way. I'm sorry, he said. He looked at me again. Does Mildred know? She doesn't, I said. Not yet. You could put it back before sunset, I added. No one would question it. He nodded once, sharp and final. I will. Jory huffed, as if approving. Carl glanced down at him. He knew, he murmured. I think he did. Carl stood, hesitated, then gave Jory a firm, grateful pat. Good dog. Jory accepted the praise the way he accepted everything else, tacitly, as if this was how things were meant to be. Thank you, Carl said, his voice rough. For this? I nodded. Go, I said, while it's still quiet. Carl walked away across the grass, his shoulders still heavy, but his steps steadier than before. Jory watched him go. Then without ceremony, he stood and wandered back toward the path, already drawn to something else that needed his attention. I took a long sip of my lemonade, cold and sharp enough to wake me fully. Because sometimes, the hardest part of doing the right thing wasn't knowing what it was choosing to do it quietly. Chapter 6. The sun was lower by the time I made my way back toward the remembrance rail. Pause remembered hadn't ended so much as it had thinned, people drifting away in 2s and 3s, the park growing emptier by degrees. A few dogs still lingered, noses pressed to the grass, reluctant to leave a place that smelled so richly of stories. The rail stood where it always had, unassuming with its twine looping between posts like a promise, kept year after year. I slowed as I approached. The empty hook was gone. In its place hung a familiar collar, the metallic silver catching the late afternoon light. The purple stone rested at the center, polished and calm, no longer calling attention to itself. Queen Eliza barks. It sat exactly where it had before, nestled between two simpler collars, as if it had never left at all. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. Mildred Paulskill stood a few steps away, hands clasped loosely in front of her, gazing at the rail with the peaceful focus of someone remembering rather than mourning. Her shoulders were straight, her posture careful but not brittle. I hesitated, then stepped closer. "Afternoon," I said. She turned, a small smile touching her mouth. "Hello, Penelope." "It's a beautiful tribute this year," I said. "Yes," she agreed. "Arthur would have liked it." She gestured toward the rail. "He always said memories deserve somewhere solid to rest." My gaze followed hers, settling on the jeweled collar. "I thought I might have misplaced it earlier," Mildred said almost absently. "But there it is, right where it belongs." "Yes," I said, "it is." She reached out, her fingertips brushing the stone for just a moment, not possessive, not lingering, just enough to acknowledge it. "People keep telling me how pretty it is," she said, as if that was the point. I smiled. Arthur always did have an eye for color. That earned a soft laugh. That he did. We stood together for a moment, the hush of the park settling around us. Somewhere nearby, a child laughed. A leash jingled, life continuing. "Well," Mildred said at last, straightening, "I suppose I should head home. It's been a long day." "Of course," I said. She nodded once more toward the rail, then turned and walked slowly down the path, her steps steady. When she was gone, I remained a moment longer, letting the scene settle. Not everything that went missing stayed lost. Not every mistake needed to be named. Sometimes, things simply found their way back to where they belonged. I turned away at last, already thinking about closing up shop, about the quiet evening ahead. As I crossed the square, I spotted Jory near the fountain, sprawled in the shade with his chin on his paws, accepting lazy scratches from a passing hand as if this were the most natural ending to the day. He glanced up when he saw me, tail thumping once against the stone. Then he settled again, content. I smiled to myself and headed home. Cornwall, for the moment, was exactly as it should be. This has been A Caller Out of Place, written by Cindy Kirk. If you have enjoyed this story, please remember to hit the like button and subscribe to be notified of each new audiobook release. Thank you for listening.